superhero in Jewish culture, it's Elijah. And you might say, well, wouldn't it be Jesus? And you would be right, but they don't like to talk about him very much. We talk more about him than they like to talk about him. But it would be Elijah. If Abraham is their father, Sarah is their mother, Moses is the symbol of authority, he's the lawgiver, David is the king, Solomon's the wise one, but Elijah, the symbol of power. He's the one that's the vessel of the power of God. If you want to talk about somebody that represents the power of God, it's Elijah. And we don't really know that much about him. We don't talk about him much because we've just got a few chapters in the Old Testament, and they've got that, and then they've got a bunch of other stories that have nothing to do with the Bible that they tell about him, right? If they were going to write comic books at the time of that, the comic books would be about Elijah, all these separate stories. So Elijah shows up out of nowhere in 2 Kings chapter 17. He shows up out of nowhere. He wanders in and he looks strange. He looks different than everybody else. He walks in and makes a pronouncement. He stops the rain for 3 years through the power of God. God does it, but he's the one that makes the pronouncement. And he comes in and stops the rain. And then 3 years later, he shows back up and defeats 450 prophets of Baal and then leads their slaughter. And then he disappears in, and then he shows back up and does some miracles, and then he's taken away. He never dies. He's taken away in a fire tornado, and they search for his body for 3 days, and they never find his body. And this is the crazy thing, because he doesn't show back up. They're like, there's this whole thing about him not being there anymore. And 3 years after he dies, 3 to 4 years after he dies, the king gets a letter from him. And the letter addresses specific things that the king is doing and tells them to quit that nonsense. And most likely what happens is he just writes down the letter before the fire tornado and says, hey, Elisha, mail this later. But instead, everybody's like, oh, he's sending letters from heaven. Like, this is what's going on. And it leads to this idea in Jewish mythology, not in the Bible, but just in their folklore, that Elijah's just out there roaming around. So you get all these stories, not in the Bible, just in their folklore, about Elijah showing up and like rescuing children from wells, or showing up to where there's a widow that's being oppressed by somebody else, and the judge has been bribed, and there's attorneys that are working against her, and Elijah shows up and testifies for her and does miracles to rescue her. And like, these stories are being told through the 13th century AD, right? They've got this whole culture about him. And then I personally think that God thinks this is hilarious, because at the end of Malachi, the last verses of Malachi, God leans into this whole idea that they have that Elijah just is still out there somewhere, because the last verses of Malachi, God says, Elijah's going to come back. He's going to come back, and he's going to be there right before the Messiah shows up. And so they're like, oh, we're right. Like, he's there. He's going to come back. He's going to be there right before the Messiah. And he does. Actually, he does come back. But Jesus says it's not actually Elijah, it's John the Baptist. And the way they describe him, he looks just like Elijah, and he acts just like Elijah. And so they've got this idea. And even today, if you go to a Jewish Passover Seder, which is the meal that they have, they drink 5 cups of wine. Well, they have 5 cups of wine. They don't drink the 5th one, because the 5th one they leave out, and it's called Elijah's cup. And they leave it out just in case Elijah happens to come to their Passover Seder. They've got a cup just for him. They've got this figure of Elijah who is the symbol of the power of God, the one that God works through, the one that never died, the one that stands out as the symbol of how God can work through somebody. But he was just a guy. In James chapter 1, James, who's the brother of Jesus, the pastor of the first church at Jerusalem, he talks about prayer and the power of prayer. And he says, Elijah, he doesn't talk about James. He is James. He says, Elijah was just a guy. He was a person just like one of us. But because he loved God, because he was faithful, when he prayed, God stopped the rain for 3 years. And when he prayed, God moved. He said that wasn't about Elijah. That was about the power of someone who loves God, who's faithful. He said that same power is available to all of us. Not the power to do whatever we want to, not the power to call down or to stop rain, to do those things, but just the power to receive whatever we need whenever we ask God in faith. The power to pray. He's just a guy. And if for us, our perspective on it is very different than their perspective, because they've got all these comic books, right? Oral comic books, I guess. But they've got all these comic books about Elijah and all the things he did. And we've just got these few chapters, so our perspective is different. But we read it and he's just a guy. But for them, he's not just a guy. Which is why it must have been pretty amazing whenever Peter, James, and John are asleep on top of a mountain while Jesus is talking. They look up and Elijah and Moses are standing there talking. Like, oh yeah, everything we ever heard was true. But he was just a guy. And for the next few weeks, we're going to look at this guy who is just a guy, but a guy who becomes the symbol of what it looks like for God to work through somebody with power. But a guy who is very flawed, not in the flawed as in cheating on his wife. As far as we know, he wasn't married. Not flawed as in the guy who steals a bunch of money from his ministry. As far as we know, he didn't do any of that. But the guy who's flawed in a way that many of us are flawed. See, Elijah's big flaw was not cheating on his wife, not stealing money, not any of those kinds of things that we look at for religious leaders. But his big flaw was that he believed God and he trusted God, but he thought that he had to do most of the work. He thought that God was depending on him to carry the ministry. He thought that God was depending on him to put on a giant show to make anything happen. God wanted to do these things, but he was depending on Elijah to make it happen. And because he did that, this guy who was faithful, who's held up as an example of faith, who becomes the image of a superhero through the power that God came to do, this guy burned out, nearly wrecked his ministry, and was at the point that he was wishing for death. Never lost his faith, never committed a sin that would disqualify him, but was still at the point that he was ready to quit it all. And what I want to do is I want to take you through how this man, who at the peak of his ministry, at the peak of his career with God, calling down fire from heaven, defeating an entire nation's worth of false prophets, could go from one day doing that to the next day saying, God, please just let me die. It starts abruptly in 1 Kings chapter 17. Now, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, they're written by, as far as we know, they're written by the prophet Jeremiah. And he writes them later. And the reason that we don't have any buildup on we have some buildup on some other prophets because we have some idea of who they were, but we don't have any idea about where Elijah came from because he came from the outskirts. He came from the borderlands. He came from nowhere. But he just shows up and starts talking. So we're going to read through this first story real quick. It's just a few verses. And then I want to go back through and tell you what some of this means. So let's start in chapter 17, verse 1 of 1 Kings. It says, Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Now, this is before the burnout. This is before the theatrics. This is before the big ministry. This is just the beginning. Now, let's go back through these verses and see what we can get from this. Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe, now in Gilead. Now, to really understand what any of these things mean, because I just read that and it tells me where I'm from, you got to be a language nerd, okay? You got to be a language nerd and get into Hebrew. Language nerds are dangerous, okay? They can be helpful, okay? If you ask a language nerd, a Hebrew language nerd, what any of this tells us, what they'll tell you is that this tells us that he is from somewhere on the very outskirts of Israel. Might go to that map right there and see how much you can see of this. So let me climb up here. Way up here. So we've got this map of Israel, and I know you can't read any of this, and that's okay. But what this tells us is that he is from the very edges of this. This is the kingdom of Israel, most of it in the green right here, okay? You don't have to read, just see the colors. Everybody but Jake can handle this. He can't see the colors. So we've got all, which for someone who cares about how he dresses so much, I don't understand how he gets by with it being colorblind. But we've got all these colors right here. This black dot right here at the bottom, that's Samaria. That's the capital. That's where the king is, the capital of the northern kingdom. Tishbe, as far as we can tell, is way over here at the edge of the green. So he's not from this stuff over here where the capital is. He's over here. Right here in the middle, we've got the Jordan River. That is the actual border that God set up. But they were able to take all this stuff on this side whenever they came into the promised land. They said, we really want this too. And God said, well, okay, you can have it. But it was never really part of this. It was always seen as other. It's always seen as other. So you've got the main part of the country, and then you got the boonies. It's what it always is. This is always changing hands over here. Now, something about the name here, and again, you got to talk to a Hebrew nerd about this, and you got to be careful talking to Hebrew nerds about this, because if you ask them questions, they will answer them. And you don't want them to answer questions because they just talk and talk and talk and talk. But I have asked the questions and endured the answers to get down to what matters, okay? What this name, there's something about the way this name is constructed that tells us that his family did not own land there. They were migrant workers. They did not own their own land. Probably what happened is they had land right on the border, and the land was lost in one of these many back and forth wars. So he's from a family that would travel from place to place looking for work. He's not landed. That means that he has no status. He has nothing to say to anybody. He has no authority to speak on anything. He has no influence on anything. So he's a guy from the boonies. He's a redneck. He's a migrant worker that shows up at the capital city to talk to the king. When Elijah is described to us, and it's later on that he's described to us, they describe his clothes. And we know his clothes are odd because the king asks, there's a prophet that gives a message, doesn't give it to the king, gives it to somebody else. And the guy says to the king, hey, this prophet gave me a message. And he says, who was it? And he says, well, I don't know who it was, but he was wearing hairy clothes and he was wearing a leather belt. And he's like, oh, that's Elijah. Because he was wearing such weird clothes that they knew who it was, because he was wearing these redneck clothes that they wore in the desert, not the clothes that everybody else wore. So this guy, and I can say redneck because if you see me in the summer, you understand my heritage and you understand that this is not offensive. I can say this because of who I am and where I come from, my people. So he's a redneck from the boonies, he's a migrant worker. He lives out where nothing he says matters to the people in the capital. This is the East, I guess, is what I'm doing over here. I don't know why. So he's out from nowhere, and that's what the Hebrew nerds will tell us about what that name means. He comes over to the capital to speak to the king, the most powerful king in this region. And he says to him, "You're evil, God's going to punish you." Now, if Elijah is the capital P prophet of the Old Testament, which he is, Ahab is the capital E evil king of the Old Testament. Like, he is just the most evil king. And he might not be that evil if it wasn't for his wife, who's Jezebel. I'm not going to describe Jezebel except to remind you that her name is synonymous with not nice lady, right? You can read into that what you want to. She's not great. She's a very, very evil lady. They led the nation in idolatry. And I want to emphasize to you, a lot of people say, well, just because they worship other gods, you're going to do all this stuff to them. Just because they had a different religion, it's not just because they have a different religion. It's because their religion is evil, okay? It's bad to worship other gods. It is evil to worship other gods. Let's start with that baseline. But when your religion involves ritual rape, when your religion involves cult prostitution, when your religion involves child sacrifice in fire, your religion is evil. And God sent them warning after warning after warning to stop this. And they refused to stop. So God says, all right, they're not listening to any of the other prophets that live there. They're not sending any of the prophets of the priest class that have influence, that have political influence, that have religious influence. I'm going to send someone with zero influence. Someone who doesn't look like them, who doesn't smell like them, who doesn't dress like them. I'm going to send someone who has no influence except my word and my power to come and speak to them. So Elijah goes and speaks to the quintessential evil king and says, I'm not even going to warn you that what you're doing is evil, because you know what you're doing is evil. I'm not even going to warn you to stop. I'm just going to demonstrate the power of God. It's not going to rain until I say it's going to rain. And the rain stops. For 3 years, there's some places it says 3, some places it says 3.5. We're rounding here, okay? 3 to 3.5 years, there is no rain. And the rain stops. Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to be Elijah and be sent on this mission? Like, you're a migrant worker. You have little to no education. You're from nowhere. You have no influence. You've never been to the capital city, much less know what's going on there. And you're supposed to walk into the palace and not even make a demand, just pronounce judgment on a kingdom and a nation. He could just kill you right there. Prophets have been killed before. Prophets will be killed again. He could kill you right then and right there. And God says, hey, I want you to go do this. And we just read the verses. We know God takes care of him after that. But I don't know if you know this or not. Elijah had not read this book. Elijah has no idea what's coming next. He says, go and pronounce judgment. There's a huge risk of danger here. There's also a risk of pride here. Like, some of us would risk danger before we rest looking stupid. Right? Would you rather be hurt or look dumb? Some of you have to think about it. Because what if God doesn't fall through? You're going to go pronounce that it's not going to rain? What if God doesn't follow through on that? If God tells you to go and tell people it's not going to rain until you decide it's going to rain, would you do that? Then there's the whole thing about a farmer saying no rain. I don't know if you've ever dealt with anything related to farming. I've never been a farmer. I'm not going to say by the grace of God, but I've never been a farmer. Grew up with cows. And if it had been raining for 4 or 5 days in a row, and I sat around my grandparents, man, I wish it would stop raining, I would be in trouble. It doesn't matter how long it's been raining. You don't want rain to stop. You take the rain when you can get the rain. Because you never know when it's going to come back. And the idea that a farmer whose entire livelihood depends on rain, especially a migrant worker who's the first one to get let go when there's nothing to harvest, is going to say no rain for 3.5 years? Who gets hurt first in this situation is him. His family, his friends get hurt first, and he calls down judgment that affects him first. Would you say yes to this? God says, I want you to travel to a place you've never been, where people not going to like you. They're going to recognize you immediately because of the way you're dressed, and they're going to know you. They're going to be able to spot you immediately and talk about you and describe you to other people just by the way that you look, and you're going to walk in with no power and confront a king, and you're going to tell him that you're going to stop the rain that's going to affect you, your friends, your family. What would you do? Elijah says, yes, I'll go. Which, if this is the end of the story, this is huge. The amount of faith, the quality of faith that is required for Elijah to just go. If that's the end of the story and he goes home, this is huge. Because most of us wouldn't get this far. Most of us would say no at this point. I know we would. Because most of us say no to stuff like this all the time. Right? How many conversations do we have like, how do I share the gospel at work without having to go talk to HR? I'm afraid I'm going to get fired. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, so I can't share the gospel at work. And we just keep having that conversation over and over again because we're afraid we're going to get fired, so we never have the conversation. We say no over and over to this same kind of request on a much smaller scale with much less to risk. I know we would say no. And yet, he said yes. He doesn't know how it's going to work out. He doesn't know how it's going to go. But he says yes, and he goes, and he confronts the king. He's there. He does his thing. And then something amazing happens. I make it to my next verse. That's the first amazing thing that happens. In verse 2, skip on ahead to verse 2 there, Mike. The word of the Lord came to him. I don't know if you know this or not. Maybe you get this idea in your head that when God has a prophet, they just talk all the time. They're just buddies. But most of the time, when God has a prophet that he speaks to him once or twice in his life. There can be decades between a time that God speaks to a prophet. But God speaks to this prophet once and again. Just pretty close back to back, which is fortunate for Elijah because he's just left hanging. He doesn't know what to do. But God speaks to him again in Samaria and says this, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. Now, that may seem like a throwaway thing to you, but this is not a throwaway thing to Elijah. I want you to think about why. Let's go back. I'm going to go back up here, okay? Let me go back up here. So, they're right here, right? Where did he come from? He came from over here in this area. He comes all the way back over here. Mike's trying for those watching online, Mike's trying. He's from over here. He travels all the way back over here to where he does not want to be, where he's never been before, where he is foreign. And what is the first thing God says to him is, you get to go back home. Come back over here. The kind of place that you know what it's like. We got to come back farther over here. Where the kind of place where you know what things are like. The kind of place where you're comfortable. The kind of place that you're used to. Go back east across the Jordan. That may be a small thing to you, but as somebody who's been sent by God away from home, it's a relief when you even get a little bit home. It's a relief to come back just a little bit. Go back to that slide there, Mike, verses 2 and 3. The word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. Now, if you go back to a brook, that's nice if you're not in a drought. If you go back to a place where there's water in a drought, that's cool, except there's no water. What good is it there to be by a drought? Except that in verse 4, I've got Mike jumping all over the place here. In verse 4, it says, you shall drink from the brook. And I've commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook of Cherith that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. God took him to one of the only places, maybe the only place where there was still water. How is there still water there? When there's no water anywhere else. When the water dries up everywhere else, God provides water at this one spot. When there's no food anywhere else, God provides Raven DoorDash twice a day. I don't want to think too much about the meat and birds bringing meat. I don't want to think about that, but I trust God that it'll work out. Now, here's the thing about this. What if Elijah had said no? I'm too scared of the consequences of this. What if they kill me? What if I look stupid? What if I'm wrong and I get over there? What if this hurts my family too much? I can't participate in this because this is going to hurt my career. It's going to hurt my family. I have no way to take care of myself today. What would have happened? One of two things happens. Like either one, he could be Jonah'd, right? And God sends some sort of a land whale and there's 3 days. I don't know how that works, but he's 3 days and then he goes and does it anyway, right? That can happen. Or he says no and God says, okay, and moves on. And now somebody else is enjoying the brook. Somebody else is enjoying the shade. Somebody else is enjoying the Raven DoorDash while he's at home dealing with the problems that would have been there anyway that he was afraid of. The problems that he said, I can't obey you in this because if I obey you in this, it's going to cost me too much. So I have to disobey you in this because the cost is too great. He would have experienced the cost anyway. But because he was willing to pay the cost, God provided for him. The only way to the provision was through obedience. But because he went through the obedience, now he's the only one being taken care of. He's the only one with the water. He's the only one with the food. But the only way to that provision was through the fear, was through the cost, was through obedience. We disobey God because we're afraid of what it's going to cost. We're afraid of what is going to happen. What is going to happen? We're afraid. But imagine what would have happened if Elijah had allowed fear to stop him from obeying. Where would he have been? At home? Starving? Comfortable? And out of work? With his family and friends? And in the same boat everybody else was in. God gave him a gift. But that gift came with a cost. But the cost of disobedience would have been so much higher than the cost of obedience ever would have been. Elijah is going to get to the point in his life where he trusts God, but he feels like he's got a lot more to do with it. He's going to get a lot more theatrical. He's going to put on these little skits, and he's going to do drama, and he's going to scream at the sky, and he's going to mock Baal. He's going to do all these other things later. But right now, at the very beginning, he just trusts God and obeys. And we get this really clear picture of faith through fear and the results. And I just want to ask you just a few questions. We'll get to the drama in a few weeks. What is God asking of you? Now, for some of you, maybe you see yourself in both Ahab and Elijah. Maybe you are a sinner who is in the midst of worshiping yourself and the idols you've set up in your life. You do whatever you want to. You do it however you want to do it. You are in a life full of sin, and you're going to stand and deal with the consequences. You have not listened to God's calls to repentance, but you're in the midst of just doing whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. Ahab was in the midst of all of this sin. He was an evil king. You say, well, I'm not an evil king. I haven't sacrificed any babies in fire. I haven't done any of that. And I believe you. But Romans tells us that the penalty for sin is death. and that all of us are sinners, and we've all received that penalty. But the gift of God is eternal life. And what Jesus told Nicodemus is that there are two paths we can choose. We can choose the path of faith, or we can choose the path of standing on our own. In John chapter 3, verse 18, he lays out what the consequences of these two paths. The first one is that whoever believes in him is not condemned. That if we choose the path of faith, if we recognize that we are sinners, that we are bound for death and hell if we stand on our own when we stand before God, and we choose to trust in Jesus to have taken that penalty for us, that we are still guilty of that sin. But we stand before God as ones who have had our punishment taken by Jesus, and we are not condemned. But if instead we don't trust in Jesus to have taken that for us, and we stand on our own, and we trust in ourselves to take that penalty and say, I'm sure I've done more good to outweigh that bad, or I have reasons for why I did that, and I can defend myself through that, we will be condemned. You've got two paths: the path that says I'm guilty and I need somebody else to take this for me, or the path that says I can figure it out on my own. The one who believes is not condemned, but the one who does not believe is condemned already. You are already condemned if you choose the second path. You are condemned because you have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And what you are being called to is not a change of lifestyle. It's not to do better. It's not to go to church. What you're being called to is to lay down the defense of yourself by yourself and to trust in Jesus, to admit that you're a sinner that can't do this on your own, to believe that Jesus is the only Son of God and the only one that can take this punishment for you, and to call out to him for forgiveness. There is a cost to that. It will cost you to do this. Maybe you're thinking of what your family is going to say. There are people that have lost family over this conversion. We were trick-or-treating in Destin and Emily's neighborhood, and we're going through and we're talking about a family that they were Jehovah's Witness, and they came to believe the gospel, and they recognized the truth of the gospel, and they realized they were sinners and they needed Jesus, and they cried out to him forgiveness, and they were saved, and they were so excited about it. But then their family completely rejected them, and they lost their family. There was a cost to that. Maybe you're afraid of that, and I can get why that would be a fear. It's a reasonable fear. Maybe you're afraid of the limitations that it's going to put on you. Maybe you're afraid of what God's going to ask you to do. I'm not going to try to convince you those aren't real fears. In fact, Jesus himself said that you should consider the cost before following him. You should consider what it will cost you, because it will cost you. Your life will not belong to you anymore. But I want to ask you not just to consider the cost of following him, but consider what disobeying him will cost. First of all, there's your eternity. Is it really worth trading your eternity for a little bit of comfort right now? Are those things you're afraid of losing really worth trading for your eternity? That family and those friends that you're afraid of losing, what if this is not them being lost to you, but what if this is the first step in them being found by Jesus? What if the dreams and the freedom that you're afraid of losing are small in comparison with the life that he has to offer you? I get that there is a cost to following Jesus, and you should consider it. But don't just consider the cost of following Jesus. Consider the cost of not following him. Maybe you don't see yourself in Ahab here at all. Maybe it's all Elijah. Maybe God is asking you to step out of your dreams, your aspirations, and he's asking you to step into his plan for your life. Maybe he's asking you to step out of the career path that you've been on and into some sort of ministry. Maybe he's asking you to step out of the current job that you're in and into something that maybe pays a little less but gives you more freedom with your family. Freedom to serve a little bit more. Maybe he's asking you to step out of a bad relationship, and I'm not talking marriage. I'm not advocating divorce. But maybe you're at the point that you're not in that marriage yet, and you're staying in a relationship you shouldn't be in because you're afraid that you're not going to find another one. And he's calling you to step out of that before you get in too deep. Maybe he's calling you to take a risk at work to share the gospel. Maybe he's calling you to take a risk in your family to extend some forgiveness or to ask for some forgiveness. And you're probably not saying no. I have a feeling you're not. Maybe you're saying no. I generally don't talk about stuff like this. I will talk about my family, but I generally don't talk about stuff like this. But I'll talk about stuff like this. Bro will get mad at me later. But she doesn't tell me no about stuff. She pretends she doesn't hear me when I say stuff. Infuriates me. You're probably not telling God no when he's asking you to do stuff. You're probably just turning the radio up. You're probably just pretending you didn't hear. And so God is asking, and you know what he's asking, but you just keep ignoring the question because you don't want to say no, but you're terrified to say yes because of what it's going to cost. Because what if you have to give up the lifestyle that you really, really like if you say yes? What if you have to do some things that you really don't want to do? What if you give up this relationship and you don't find anybody else? What if you share the gospel and you lose your job? What if you ask for forgiveness and they say no? What if you extend forgiveness and they act like there's nothing for you to forgive? What's the cost? I don't want to pretend the cost isn't real, guys. I don't want to pretend it's not real because it's real. But what's the cost of disobeying? When you're in that relationship and now you're married and you can't get out of it. You got kids and you can't get out of it. That person is gone and you can't share the gospel anymore. That time that you had with the kids is over and the kids don't want to hang out with you anymore. And it's too late to make the decision to step back a little bit at work or change directions at work. And you've lost the time that you had where they would have willingly spent time with you. What's the cost of disobeying? Elijah faced the cost and went through anyway. And it was on the other side of the fear of the cost that he found provision. And I'm telling you, the same God that provided the brook and the ravens and the shade for Elijah is the God who sent his son to die for you and to rescue you and provide for you, and is the same God that will smile when you face the cost, because you'd rather pay the cost of obedience than face the cost of disobedience. So what'll it be? You want to keep turning the radio up? Pretending you didn't hear the question? I'm saying you'll deal with it later. When things slow down. When things get easier. Are you going to be honest with yourself about what God's been saying to you? I don't want to pretend that it's going to be easy. I don't want to pretend that I think it's simple, because I know it's not. Any more than I think that Elijah wasn't scared to death when he walked into the court of that king in his clothes that looked different than everybody else's, with a name that nobody had ever heard before, the name that they didn't need Hebrew nerds to explain to them that meant that he was nobody and nothing. But he did it anyway. And because he did it, he took the first step into being the man that we think of as the epitome of the vessel of the power of God. But what James said about that is that he wasn't special because he was somehow better than us. He was special because he had faith, and he was special because he didn't just consider the cost of obedience, but he considered the cost of disobedience. So make your choice. Will you crank that volume up one more time? Will you pretend you can't hear the question one more time? Will you be honest and have a real conversation with God about what he's asking and what you're afraid of? Would you stand? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you right now, and I'm so grateful for this short set of verses. I'm so grateful, Lord, that we can see both the cost of obedience and the cost of disobedience, and that you are a good Father. And Lord, I know that I am an evil human, but I love my children. If my children ask for bread, I will not give them a stone. And if they ask for fish, I will not give them a snake. And if I, being evil, would not give evil gifts to my children, but good gifts, how much more will you, who are perfect, give good gifts to your children whom you love? And so I ask, Lord, that we would look not just to the cost of what you're asking, but look to your nature. Look to your actions in the past. Look to the demonstrations of your love that you've made toward us, and trust you as Elijah trusted you. That we'd obey you in whatever it is that you're asking, that we would not turn the volume up and ignore the question, but that we would be honest with you about what we're afraid of, that we would consider the cost of obeying you, and we would talk to you about it. But that you would show us the cost of disobeying you as well, and that we would step out in faith to see what's on the other side. I guarantee you, now I don't want to guarantee you anything, Lord, but I firmly believe that Elijah had no idea how you were going to take care of him, or even that you were going to take care of him. I know he was surprised when he arrived at the brook Cherith and was fed by ravens and had a stream in the middle of a drought. And I look forward to seeing how surprised and delighted the people of this church are when they see how you provide, even when they risk it all to obey you. I thank you, Lord. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.